The following podcast was produced by Big Head Amusements for KQEK.com. E.C. Woodley's work encompasses film music, live performances in theater and dance, and experimental sound design. From our lengthy conversation about his film work, scoring Rhinoceros Eyes for brother at York University graduate Aaron Woodley, and Antiviral for cousin and Ryerson graduate Brandon Cronenberg, I think you'll quickly realize that what seems like the creation of unconventional sounds for films with unusual concepts is really meticulously conceived designs which match a film's oral and visual designs. Nowhere is this more apparent than in his latest work, Antiviral, a peculiar tale of celebrity obsession where fans can inject themselves with a star's latest cold or flu bug and feel a little closer to their idol through microbial contact. Woodley's career began as an assistant to Michael Kamen, and after some creative soul-searching, he returned to film via short and feature-length projects. Had you scored short films before making the move to feature films?
My first film gig was working with Michael Kamen in London, and I was his first assistant, and which is to say, his only assistant at the time. This was many years ago, and I wrote source music for some things that he did, and orchestration, and whatever he needed, everything from cleaning his desk to if he was having trouble with a particular scene, he'd usually give it to me, and I try and write something to sort of help get him started. So that was sort of my first work. So I started with features, and then I stopped writing for quite a while, and it was my brother Aaron who got me back into film, and I wrote the score for, I guess it was his graduate film at York called The Wager, and we used many tracks of Joe Massarolo's accordion playing. Joe is one of the great new music accordion players, and he's premiered work by a lot of the contemporary classical composers, and I'd studied with him for a little while. That began a kind of way of working, I think, because I really enjoyed layering the tracks of his work. And so I think we had 24 or 36 tracks of accordion, and sort of used him as an orchestra, and it fit with the strange theme of the film. And then I did Aaron's second short, and then his first feature, which was called Rhinoceros Eyes, which again had a lot of the same guys working on it that he met at York. Dave Green, the DOP, for example.
Are there any specific things that you learned from Michael Kamen which you felt really helped you in not just doing non-film composition, but also film composition as well?
It's interesting because I think the music that I've produced after Michael is probably very, very different than Michael's work. It was just great to be around him. It was really an apprenticeship because I watched what he was doing. We talked a lot about how to work, but I don't think the styles in which I write probably have a lot to do with the stuff that he was writing. But just it's really, these kind of apprenticeship situations are really amazing. There's a certain amount of figuring stuff out on your own, and then at the same time you're figuring stuff out in proximity to someone who's doing it and who's also figuring out a lot of stuff. The first film I worked on with him was Brazil, which I think was only his third film, maybe. And so he had a pretty good career as a keyboard player and arranger, and at the time he was known more for his rock and roll arrangements. He'd done that Eurythmics record, which was one of the first records of the period to use strings in it again in pop music.
In the time between Brazil and your first film, did you take time off to essentially decide what you wanted to do, as well as pursue different kinds of musical styles, and maybe do a bit of experimenting?
I work as a visual artist and a curator and an art critic as well. And I worked in theater a lot. I have sometimes 4 or 5 media that I'm working in on and off. Over time, I became more and more interested in visual art, visual stimulus, and that I think fed into my interest in film composing. I think a lot of in terms of color, in relationship to music. I rarely use samplers, but I tend to use my own acoustic material that in pitch shifting or stretching or the various types of modifications that happen with them happen a kind of chance elements. And so I think, exposure to a lot of different types of visual and also audio stimulus sort of inform this way of working, which I find lately is really very much based in the digital editing process and the sort of the processes of transforming the basic material that can happen in the digital editing context.
One of the aspects that I like both about the film Antiviral and the score is the way the two elements, the sound and the visuals, work so seamlessly together. And I'm curious from your perspective, because it is a horror film, what sort of things inspired you to write the cues and do the particular kind of sound? Because there are some parts where there are some organic instruments, but they don't sound wholly organic. They fuse really beautifully with the electronic material.
I think a lot of that came out of the film itself. I usually try, I sort of, as I said, I build up a kind of, it's not really a sample library because I don't use a keyboard usually, but I sort of, after sessions with musicians, I often record extra material that I later use to sort of manipulate in a layered way to produce color. And a lot of the stuff that I was trying on rough cuts of Antiviral really didn't work. It's quite amazing, actually, when I've mentioned that, you know, the score is one of many decisions, you know, that contribute to the overall film. And I find if the composer is sensitive enough to the material that he's given, sort of the way maybe a tailor, you know, works with a particular body, then certain things just don't work, and you really have to find strategies to fit the film particularly. And by fitting it, I mean not just, of course, the length of each cue and where the music starts and stops, but the psychological cast of the film and the motivation of the characters, these sorts of things, and the sort of emotional tone of the film. So that seemed to really reject purely acoustic instruments, which I found interesting. You know, it's like, because the film is also so biologically based, you know, the film was sort of rejecting these organic sounds the way a body rejects a transplant or something. It just didn't like acoustic material. And so that meant, in a lot of cases, at the same time, it didn't. I personally find that the very hermetic sounding synth, which has no air, which is something that is, you know, it's kind of like most synths sound out of the box, wasn't satisfying either because it didn't have any hint of organicness, and it had no air. So it was a question of manipulating acoustic sources and giving them some strange kind of synthetic quality, but not leaving behind a sense of the organic. And I think Brandon Cronenberg was very aware of this as well. And it was you know, really interesting to see the film change in the editing room because it seemed like a lot of the dialogue and the narrative scenes were being compressed into these more visual scenes. And so the music really became part of the structure of the film in a very real way. And in order to do that, I think, as an editor needs to have a good sense of music and how the music's used. And then when it gets to the composer, of course, there's a sort of structure in place already, and a need or a desire of the imagery for music to help tell its story. And in this case, the music is also fairly ambient, and I don't totally understand it, but I find it's interesting that the music is somewhat synthetic, and yet the story that it's telling isn't really physical and biological. I don't know if I'm interested to know what you made of, let's say, there's a lot of blood and physical decay going on, and how the music sort of worked with that.
It's funny because initially, like, I had reviewed the score beforehand, so I had an idea of what the music was like, and I was really keen to see how it worked with the film. And after a while, I think I was so involved in the visuals and the storyline that I kind of forgot when the music was coming in and when it was coming out. And I think the only time where I became really aware of it was in the dream sequences, because it worked so well there, and it was a really strong component in those sequences. But I think what I enjoyed a lot about the film is that it's not a cold clinical film, and it's the same thing with the music. It's not cold and clinical. You do have a sense of the characters, you do have a sense of the mood. I think because there may be vestiges of organic sounds in the score, and because the film is centered on a handful of very specific characters, you do and can identify with them, or at least can lock into them. So it's not a detached film.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad this is a typically film composer thing to say, but I'm glad you didn't notice the score all the time. That's something of a cliche that a good score isn't noticed, but I think it's true to some degree. At the same time, Lou Solikovsky and Brandon, who mixed the music in relation to the dialogue in the film, and Brandon are very sensitive to music and aware of its role, and so there's a lot of attention to, I think, good attention to the level in which the music was playing in the film. So it's and there's actually a lot of use of surrounds as well. So it's really, there's a very immersive sort of feeling that I think if you see the film in a theater or in a surround setup, it's like being immersed in a pond or something. Not always a pleasant temperature necessarily, but I think that's part of the way the music can be effective in this film, and some of that comes from the main character, Sid March, which is played really beautifully by Caleb Landry Jones. Mm-hmm. He also gives an extremely physical performance, some of which was influenced, I think, by his interest in silent film. And there are times where he doesn't have a lot of dialogue, but he's doing a lot with his body and a lot with his face. And a lot of his sort of psychological world is not something that he's consciously aware of. And so I think this sort of quality of the music existing in this sort of very physical and immersive ambient place and influencing mood and producing color and things like that very much work as an extension of his psychological state. Mm-hmm. and put the viewer in a particularly physical place.
Mm-hmm. I take it this was your first genuine horror film?
No. I don't think. This is true of music as well, because I listen to a lot of early music, ancient music, contemporary classical music, and a lot of stuff. But I don't think a lot about genre when I'm scoring the film. And I think Antiviral is really interesting because it's a horror film, but it's also, it's a black comedy. It's a social critique. It's doing a lot of things. It has some detective story-like overtones, I didn't feel that I had to produce any particular sort of genre of music. I would say that the closest to a true horror film that I've scored would be The Dark Hours by Paul Fox. And Paul I think, was very consciously trying to make an intelligent genre film. And for that, it was mostly small ensembles, string quartets, and more new music techniques related to sort of Penderecki or Webern, Morton Feldman, people like that, which has to do with some of my training, I would say, and some of Paul's interest in films like The Shining and things like that that use contemporary classical music as a score.
And then for Antiviral's horror elements themselves, did you find those were difficult to score? Because there's no, I mean, I guess the comparison would be for a biological horror film made by Brandon's father, the elements are much more visceral, but Brandon kind of seemed to focus on very specific things to show sort of the penetration of the skin and the gradual way that things kind of emerge both physically and psychologically, which I really liked. But there are still a few moments in the film which are quite strong, and I wondered how you dealt with those, either in terms of your own personal tastes or whether it was something that you'd perhaps been accustomed to in either seeing horror films or seeing films from David Cronenberg.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because there's certain kinds of horror that I think, obviously, everybody has a preference of the kind of horror elements that they like, and others that they find outright revolting, or they just simply can't watch because it's too intense. And
yeah, it was funny. I found the blood didn't bother me. I don't know if that's because I've seen enough. One sees that sort of thing. I don't know, in the world. Also, if you cut yourself or. It's a kind of, or maybe it is a kind of trope that one is exposed to a lot. I don't know. The stuff that really troubled me was the Karim, the DOP's treatment of the macro photography. So the iris opening and these super close-up shots of skin and things like that. Those were the things that disturbed me the most, I think. Maybe because one isn't used to thinking of skin or getting this kind of vantage point. For me, that's where the horror lay. I don't know. I can't remember if I scored any of those scenes. But for me, the sort of scenes of deterioration, my cue was more Caleb's performance and the sort of physicality of his performance. And I think I have... music, anyway, I think has a physical aspect. Sound waves are really physical phenomena that reach your ear, and so I find the way a violin is bowed, and in the tunings of things, I tend to like things that are slightly off tuning, because it's like a broken color in painting rather than a pure color. It's a little more complex, and it can be a bit more disturbing. I follow the physical contortions of the character, I would say, rather than having any approach to, say, a bloody scene or something. I know if you do chases, a lot of composers may use the same theme in a chase scene in a different film or something, and you sort of have that in your pocket. But, I try and really fit the music uniquely to the film, if at all possible, and at all times. I don't really have an approach to a particular moment from a particular genre or any of that kind of direct association.
And then my next to last question is just, did you find any specific differences in terms of working with family members versus non-family members in terms of an understanding where you know the kind of taste that they have, you have an idea of their kind of visual style and the writing style, and that perhaps there was more unspoken stuff that you were able to feed off instead of having lengthy conversations and relying more on sort of visual examples of what they have? in their films?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think, the deadlines in film always loom large. And so to start out from a place of particular knowledge is a great help. Each director has their own style and way of communication and way of working with a composer. And some are voluble and some are more laconic. And, a certain amount of the work that I do ends up being intuitive anyway. There's not a huge amount of talking, I find, ever. There's often a lot of auditioning of things. And, that's right or that's not right. But it really depends on the director and what their style is. And so, yeah, it's a really great pleasure to work with family in that sense, because I really do know where they're coming from in a real way. And I think that's helpful.
And then my last question is just, is there another film that you're working on right now?
No, not at the moment. There's a conversation about a few things, but nothing's confirmed at the moment.
Because I know that the Antiviral soundtrack is available from Lakeshore Records, so I think that probably be a really important calling card, because it's got wide distribution and will probably be reviewed in a number of publications.
Yeah, I hope so. It's lovely that they were interested, and it was really a great experience doing a little touching up of remixing and things on the score, because it's actually very rare that I think a composer listens to the score on its own.
The score for Antiviral is available from Lakeshore Records as a digital album. For related film and film music reviews, please visit KQEK.com. This program is copyright 2013 by Mark R. Hassan.